Single dad found billionaire's deaf son, abandoned at airport. The discovery that would change two lives forever happened at Gate C-42 in Denver International Airport, where a janitor's routine midnight shift collided with a mystery that no parent should ever have to face. What Marcus Rivera found sitting alone on that cold metal bench wasn't just an abandoned child. It was the missing heir to a technology empire, a 4-year-old boy whose silence held secrets that would shake one of Colorado's most powerful families to its core. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects as Marcus pushed his cleaning cart through the nearly empty terminal, the wheels squeaking in rhythm with his exhausted footsteps. It was 11:58 p.m. on a Tuesday. The kind of shift that paid an extra $2 an hour because most people didn't want to mop up the world's messes when everyone else was sleeping. But Marcus Rivera needed every dollar he could scrape together, even if it meant working until his hands bled and his back screamed for mercy. At 28, Marcus looked like a man who'd aged in dog years. Deep lines around dark brown eyes that had seen too much loss, calloused hands that told stories of 16-hour workdays, and shoulders that carried more weight than any single father should ever have to bear. His navy blue uniform was clean, but worn thin at the elbows, the name tag hanging slightly crooked because he'd been rushing to get to work after dropping his 6-year-old daughter Sophia at his neighbor's cramped apartment. Sophia, just thinking her name, sent a familiar spike of panic through his chest. 6 years old, bright as a supernova, and completely dependent on him since her mother Elena had died in that twisted wreckage of metal and rain 2 years ago. The medical bills from Elena's final weeks in intensive care still arrived like clockwork in red-stamped envelopes, and Sophia's asthma medication cost more each month than Marcus made in a week of day shifts at Rodriguez Auto Repair. Which was exactly why he found himself here at midnight, mopping floors in an airport that never slept, trying to piece together enough income to keep their heads above water, in a world that seemed designed to drown people like them. Marcus paused near Gate C-42, one of the quiet gates, where red-eye flights departed for cities that existed only in his imagination. Los Angeles, Miami, New York, places that might as well have been on Mars when you were counting quarters for groceries and praying the electricity wouldn't get shut off before payday. That's when he saw something that made his blood turn to ice water. Sitting alone on a bench near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old clutched a small backpack to his chest like a life preserver. The child had sandy brown hair that looked like it hadn't been combed in hours, and he wore an expensive-looking navy jacket that seemed 3 sizes too big for his tiny frame. But what stopped Marcus dead in his tracks wasn't the boy's appearance, it was the look in his eyes, a kind of supernatural stillness that no child should possess. The patient waiting of someone who had learned too early that adults sometimes vanished into thin air without warning. Marcus scanned the gate area with growing alarm. Empty chairs stretched in every direction. No frantic parents searching. No airline personnel looking concerned. No security guards investigating. Just this impossibly small boy sitting perfectly motionless in the harsh fluorescent light, as if he'd been carefully placed there and forgotten like a piece of lost luggage. The silence was wrong. All wrong. Children didn't sit this quietly unless something terrible had happened. Marcus abandoned his cart without a second thought and approached slowly, the way you might move toward a wounded animal that could either flee or attack without warning. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, crouching, down to the boy's eye level so he wouldn't seem threatening. "Are you okay?" The child looked at him with startlingly blue eyes. The kind of blue you saw in magazine photos of tropical oceans, but didn't respond. Not even a nod or shake of the head. Marcus tried again, speaking louder in case the boy was scared or in shock. "Where are your mom and dad? Are they coming back?" Still nothing. The boy just stared at him with those impossibly blue eyes, and then suddenly raised his small hands and began moving them in quick, deliberate gestures that looked like sign language. The realization hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. The boy was deaf, and Marcus didn't know a single word of sign language. Here was a child who needed help, who was obviously lost or abandoned, and Marcus couldn't even ask him his name. But he could recognize desperation when he saw it, and this little boy was drowning in it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Marcus sat down on the cold metal bench next to the boy, moving slowly so he wouldn't frighten him. He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed, "What's your name?" He turned the screen toward the child, who studied it with the intense concentration of someone much older. The boy's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion Marcus had seen from him, and he pointed to himself. Then held up 4 small fingers, then pointed to the backpack beside him. Marcus nodded encouragingly, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the boy unzip the small backpack with careful, practiced movements. Inside was a change of clothes, folded with military precision, a juice box, and a piece of paper folded so neatly it looked like it had been pressed with an iron. The boy handed him the paper with the solemnity of someone delivering a court summons. Marcus unfolded it with hands that had started to shake, and what he read made the entire world tilt sideways. His name is David. He is 4 years old. He is deaf. He cannot hear you, but he is very smart. I cannot take care of him anymore. Please find him a good family. He deserves better than me. That was it. No last name, no contact information, no explanation for how a 4-year-old had ended up alone in an airport at midnight. Just a note that sounded like a suicide letter written by someone's breaking heart. Marcus looked back at David. At least now he had a name, who was watching his face with the careful attention of a child who had learned to read adults' emotions for survival clues. Those blue eyes held no tears, no panic, no childish confusion, just the terrible, unnatural patience of someone who had already learned that adults couldn't always be trusted to stay. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, then immediately felt guilty for cursing in front of a child, even one who couldn't hear him. The questions crashed through his mind like a tsunami. Who abandons a 4-year-old at an airport? Where were the police, the FBI, the Amber Alert? How long had David been sitting here? Was he hungry? Scared? Did he understand that whoever had left him here wasn't coming back? Marcus typed on his phone again, "I'm Marcus. I'm going to help you." David read the message, tilted his head slightly, and then nodded with the grave seriousness of a judge delivering a verdict. In that moment, Marcus Rivera, a janitor who worked 2 jobs to afford his daughter's asthma medication, had no idea that he was looking at David Kingston, the missing heir to a technology empire worth over $3 billion. He had no idea that the expensive jacket the boy wore cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, or that David's disappearance had triggered a private army of investigators who had been searching for him for 72 hours. He had no idea that David's father, Charles Kingston, was at that very moment sitting in his therapist's office, finally admitting the truth that had been eating him alive. He was failing his deaf son in every way that mattered, and maybe, just maybe, David would be better off with someone who could love him the way he deserved to be loved. All Marcus knew was that a little boy needed help, and every instinct he possessed as a father was screaming at him to provide it. Marcus typed on his phone, "Are you hungry?" David nodded immediately, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of something that might have been hope cross those blue eyes. What Marcus Rivera couldn't have known was that this single moment of compassion, this choice to help a child instead of calling security, was about to set in motion a chain of events that would destroy one family and create another. Because sometimes the most important decisions in life happen in airports at midnight, between the end of one story and the beginning of another. Sometimes salvation comes disguised as a janitor with kind eyes and gentle hands. And sometimes the children we save end up saving us right back. Marcus stood up, David's small hand slipping trustingly into his calloused palm, and together they walked toward a future that neither of them could have imagined. A future that would arrive 3 weeks later, in the form of a black limousine carrying adoption papers, and the promise of a love powerful enough to heal 2 broken hearts. But first, Marcus had to make the hardest phone call of his life. The Denver County Foster Care Facility sat like a tired brick fortress in the industrial part of the city, surrounded by chain-link fencing and the kind of playground equipment that had seen better decades. Marcus Rivera stood in the visitor parking lot the next evening, clutching a small bag containing a toy airplane he'd bought at the airport gift shop with money he couldn't really afford to spend. 24 hours had passed since he'd found David, and Marcus hadn't been able to concentrate on anything else. During his day shift at Rodriguez Auto Repair, he'd found himself thinking about those blue eyes, about the careful way David had eaten that sandwich, about how the boy had reached for his hand when the social worker arrived. Sophia had noticed his distraction immediately. At 6 years old, she had the intuitive radar that children develop when they've experienced loss early. "Papa, you're thinking loud again," she'd said over their dinner of mac and cheese and canned green beans. "Thinking loud? Like when you worry about the bills. Your face gets scrunchy." She demonstrated by furrowing her small brow in an exaggerated imitation that made Marcus laugh despite himself. "I met a little boy yesterday," Marcus had explained. "He's alone, like you were when Mama got sick. I want to make sure he's okay." Sophia had considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Is he scared?" "I think so, Mija." "Then you should visit him." "When I was scared in the hospital, the nice lady who brought coloring books made everything less scary." And that's how Marcus found himself walking through the double doors of the foster facility at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday, carrying a $3 toy airplane and hoping it would bring a smile to a little boy who'd had precious few reasons to smile. The lobby smelled like industrial disinfectant and reheated food. Behind the reception desk sat a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the patient expression of someone who'd learned to expect the worst while hoping for the best. "I'm here to see David," Marcus said, "the little boy who came in yesterday. I'm the one who found him at the airport." The receptionist, whose name tag read Gloria, studied him for a moment. "You're Marcus Rivera?" "Yes, ma'am." Gloria's expression softened slightly. "Rebecca Martinez left a note about you. Said you might come by. David's been asking about you all day." "Asking?" "Well, signing. We have one staff member who knows basic sign language, and David keeps making the same sign over and over. When we showed him your business card, he got excited." Marcus felt something warm unfold in his chest. David had been asking for him. Gloria led him down a hallway lined with motivational posters about resilience and hope, past common rooms where children of various ages sat watching television or working on homework. Marcus caught glimpses of kids who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of day. Children who'd learned too early that the world wasn't always a safe place. They stopped at a door marked Quiet Room. Through the small window, Marcus could see David sitting at a child-sized table, working intently on something with crayons. "He's been drawing all day," Gloria said quietly. Won't let anyone see what he's making. Marcus knocked softly on the door frame. David looked up, and his face transformed with a smile so bright it could have powered the building. The boy jumped up from his chair and ran to Marcus, wrapping his arms around Marcus's legs in a hug that nearly knocked him over. Marcus knelt down and pulled out his phone, typing quickly, "Hi, David. How are you?" David grabbed the phone and typed back, "Marcus, come back. I promised I would. I brought you something." Marcus handed him the small bag. David opened it carefully, as if gift receiving was a skill he was still learning. When he saw the toy airplane, his eyes went wide. He clutched it to his chest, then set it down gently on the table and began making elaborate hand gestures. His face animated with excitement. Marcus wished desperately that he could understand what David was trying to tell him. David seemed to sense his frustration. The boy went to the table and picked up the paper he'd been working on. It was a drawing, made with the intense concentration only a 4-year-old could bring to art. The picture showed 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, standing next to what was clearly meant to be an airplane. Above them, David had drawn a yellow sun with careful rays extending in all directions. At the bottom of the page, in letters that were wobbly but determined, he had written, "Marcus and David." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "You drew this for me?" David nodded and handed him the picture, then typed on Marcus's phone, "You nice to David." "David is nice to Marcus too," Marcus typed back. They spent the next hour sitting together at the small table. David showed Marcus how the toy airplane's wheels could retract, then drew more pictures. Airplanes in various configurations, some with people inside waving. Marcus found himself thinking about Sophia's drawings, which covered their refrigerator at home. Her pictures were usually of the 3 of them, Marcus, Sophia, and Elena. Even though Elena had been gone for 2 years, children, Marcus realized, drew their families as they wished they could be. Not always as they were. Rebecca Martinez appeared in the doorway around 7:30. "Mr. Rivera? Could I speak with you for a moment?" "Who for?" Quote. Marcus typed on his phone for David. "I'll be right back. Keep drawing." David nodded and immediately began work on another airplane. In the hallway, Rebecca's expression was troubled. "We've had an interesting development," she said. "This afternoon, we received a call from a private investigator named Janet Pierce. She's been hired to locate a missing child named David Kingston." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Kingston, as in Kingston Technologies. Charles Kingston, the CEO. Apparently, his 4-year-old son went missing 3 days ago from their home in Cherry Hills Village. Cherry Hills Village. One of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Denver, where houses started at $2 million and went up from there. David is. Marcus started. The son of one of the richest men in Colorado. Driving down from the family's estate as we speak. Marcus looked back through the window at David, who was carefully coloring the wings of his latest airplane drawing. A billionaire's son, abandoned at an airport. It didn't make sense. What did the investigator say? About how David went missing? Rebecca lowered her voice. That's where it gets complicated. According to the investigator, Charles Kingston reported his son missing to private security, not to the police. No Amber Alert, no public notifications. She said Mr. Kingston prefers to handle family matters discreetly. Who abandons a billionaire's son at an airport? Marcus asked. Well, someone with access to the house who was desperate enough to risk everything, Rebecca said grimly. We're looking at kidnapping, possibly by a family member or employee. The FBI might get involved. Marcus felt the bottom drop out of his world. David wasn't just an abandoned child, he was potentially the victim of a crime. And Marcus, who'd been thinking about ways to help this little boy, was about to lose him to a world of wealth and private investigators and FBI agents. "When is she arriving?" Marcus asked. "Any minute." As if summoned by their conversation, Gloria appeared at the end of the hallway. "Rebecca? There's someone here to see you. Says her name is Janet Pierce." Marcus followed Rebecca to the lobby, where a woman in an expensive suit was waiting. Janet Pierce looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom, perfectly styled blonde hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of confidence that came with charging $500 an hour. "Miss Martinez? I'm here about the Kingston boy." Rebecca nodded. "We'll need to verify his identity, of course." "Of course." Janet pulled out an iPad and showed them a photo. It was unmistakably David. Same sandy brown hair, same blue eyes. But in this picture he was wearing different clothes and sitting in what looked like an elaborately decorated child's playroom. "This photo was taken 2 weeks ago," Janet explained. "David Kingston, age 4, deaf since birth. He was last seen at the family estate 3 days ago." "Last seen by whom?" Marcus found himself asking. Janet studied him. "And you are?" "Marcus Rivera. I'm the one who found David at the airport." Janet's expression sharpened with interest. "I see. Mr. Rivera, I'll need to ask you some questions about the circumstances of how you found David. I found him sitting alone at gate C, 42, around midnight. He had a backpack and a note." Marcus hesitated. The note said someone couldn't take care of him anymore. Janet and Rebecca exchanged glances. "Mr. Rivera," Janet said carefully, "David Kingston lives with his father in a $15 million estate. He has round-the-clock care from specially trained staff. Someone didn't abandon him, someone took him and then left him at that airport." The implications hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. David hadn't been abandoned by desperate parents who couldn't cope. David had been kidnapped and then dumped by someone who'd gotten scared. "Who would do that?" Marcus asked. "We're working on that," Janet said. "Mr. Kingston is very concerned about his son's welfare. He wants David brought home immediately." "What about the person who left him there? What happens to them?" Janet's expression went cold. "Mr. Kingston is prepared to press full charges for kidnapping. When we find whoever did this, they'll face federal prison time." Marcus felt sick. Probably someone who worked for the Kingston family, someone who might have grown to love David, had made a desperate choice and was now facing life in prison for it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. "Can I see him?" Marcus asked. "David, I mean." "Before." Janet looked surprised. "Mr. Rivera, I appreciate that you helped David when you found him. But this is a family matter now. David needs to be returned to his father as quickly as possible." "5 minutes," Marcus said. "I promised him I'd come back. I just want to say goodbye." Janet glanced at her expensive watch. "Mr. Kingston is expecting his son within the hour." "Please," Marcus said. "David's been through a lot. He shouldn't just disappear again." Rebecca stepped in. It would be traumatic for David to leave without saying goodbye to the person who helped him. 5 minutes, then we'll bring him out." Janet nodded impatiently. 5 minutes. Marcus walked back to the quiet room, his heart heavy. Through the window, he could see David still drawing. The toy airplane positioned carefully beside his elbow like a talisman. When Marcus entered, David looked up with that brilliant smile. He immediately reached for Marcus's phone and typed, "Marcus, come back again." Marcus sat down beside him, trying to figure out how to explain what was about to happen. He typed, "David, I have to tell you something important. David's expression grew serious, as if he could sense the weight of what was coming. Marcus typed slowly, "Your dad is coming to get you. You're going to go home." David stared at the phone for a long moment, then looked up at Marcus with confusion. He typed, "Dad here?" "Yes, your dad is here. He's been looking for you." David's face scrunched up in concentration. He typed, "Dad's sick. Dad cry." Marcus felt a chill. David was talking about his father being sick, crying. What had this little boy witnessed before he ended up at the airport? "David," Marcus typed. "Did someone bring you to the airport?" David nodded. "Who?" David looked around the room, then picked up a crayon and drew quickly on a fresh piece of paper. The figure he drew was clearly meant to be a woman with long hair. Underneath, he wrote shakily, "Anna. Anna." Someone named Anna had taken David to the airport and left him there. Marcus typed, "Why did Anna take you to the airport?" David's expression grew sad. He drew another quick picture, a man lying in bed, with teardrops coming from his eyes. Then he pointed to himself and shook his head. Marcus was starting to understand. David's father had been sick, probably struggling with mental health issues. Maybe Anna, whoever she was, had been trying to protect David from something happening at home. David typed, "Anna sad. Anna say David needs safe." The pieces clicked together. Anna, probably a nanny or caregiver, had seen something that convinced her David wasn't safe at home. So, she'd made the desperate choice to take him to a public place where he'd be found quickly and cared for. Rebecca appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Rivera? It's time." Marcus looked at David, who was watching his face carefully. This little boy, who'd just started to trust him, was about to be taken back to whatever situation had been bad enough to make someone risk prison to get him away from it. Marcus typed, "David, you're a very good boy. Remember that." David read the message, then climbed into Marcus's lap and hugged him tightly. Marcus held the small, warm body against his chest and felt something break inside him. "Mr. Rivera?" Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. Marcus carried David out to the lobby, where Janet Pierce was waiting with a man Marcus hadn't seen before. He was tall, wearing an expensive suit, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of tan that came from vacations in places most people only saw in magazines. Charles Kingston. The man looked at David with an expression that was hard to read. Relief, yes, but also something that might have been discomfort. "David!" Charles said aloud, then seemed to remember that his son couldn't hear him. Charles pulled out his phone and typed something, then showed it to David. "Hello, son. Are you okay?" David studied his father's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. But Marcus noticed that David didn't smile, didn't reach for his father, the way he'd reached for Marcus. Charles typed again. "We're going home now." David looked back at Marcus, his blue eyes wide with something that might have been fear. Marcus knelt down and typed on his phone. "You're going to be okay, David. Your dad loves you." Even as he typed it, Marcus wondered if it was true. David hugged him once more, then walked to his father's side. Charles placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Formal, distant, the way you might touch a business associate. "Mr. Rivera," Charles said, and Marcus was surprised by the man's voice. It was quieter than he'd expected, with an edge of exhaustion. "Thank you for finding my son. He's a good kid," Marcus replied. "He's smart, and he loves airplanes." Charles nodded absently, as if this information was interesting but not particularly relevant. Janet Pierce stepped forward. "Mr. Kingston, we should go. And Mr. Rivera, someone from our office will be in touch if we need any additional information about the kidnapping." Marcus watched as they led David toward the exit. At the door, David turned back and waved. the toy airplane clutched in his free hand. Marcus waved back, and then they were gone. Rebecca stood beside him in the sudden quiet of the lobby. "That felt wrong," Marcus said. "What do you mean?" The way his father looked at him, like David was a problem that had been solved, not a son who'd been found. Rebecca sighed. "Mr. Rivera, Charles Kingston is one of the most powerful men in Colorado. David will have every advantage, the best schools, the best medical care, the best of everything. Except someone who actually wants to be with him," Marcus said. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about David's drawing of Anna, about the tears he'd drawn, falling from his father's eyes, about the way David had clung to him in those final moments. Something was wrong with this picture. Children didn't get kidnapped by their caregivers and abandoned at airports unless something at home was terribly wrong. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He called in sick to work and drove to Cherry Hills Village. The Kingston estate sat behind iron gates and perfect landscaping, a monument to wealth that seemed to stretch for acres. Marcus parked across the street and waited, though he wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Around noon, a black sedan pulled out of the gates. Through the window, Marcus caught a glimpse of Charles Kingston in the back seat, talking on his phone. 20 minutes later, another car approached, a modest Honda Civic that looked out of place in this neighborhood of Ferraris and Teslas. The woman who got out was in her 30s, with long, dark hair and the kind of face that suggested kindness mixed with worry. She walked to the gates and pressed the intercom button. Marcus couldn't hear what she said. But after a moment, the gates opened, and she drove through. Anna. Marcus was sure. This was the woman who'd taken David to the airport. Marcus waited until the Honda reappeared an hour later, then followed at a distance as it wound through suburban streets to a modest apartment complex in Aurora. He watched the woman park and walk toward one of the buildings, then made his decision. "Excuse me," he called as he got out of his car. "Are you Anna?" The woman froze, her hand on the building's door. When she turned, Marcus could see that her eyes were red from crying. "Who's asking?" she said quietly. "My name is Marcus Rivera. I'm the one who found David at the airport." Anna's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please," Marcus said. "I just want to understand what happened. David is a good kid. He drew a picture of you. He said you told him he needed to be safe." Anna stared at him for a long moment, then burst into tears. "I didn't know what else to do," she sobbed. "Charles was getting worse, and David was so scared, and I couldn't watch anymore." Marcus stepped closer carefully. "Charles was getting worse. How?" Anna wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You're not a reporter, are you? Or a private investigator? I'm a janitor and a single dad. I care about what happens to David." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Anna's shoulders sagged. "Charles Kingston has been spiraling into depression for months," she said. "Ever since his wife died last year. He barely comes out of his room some days. And David tries so hard to be good, to not be a bother. But Charles just looks at him like he's another problem to solve." Marcus felt his heart sink. "What made you take David away?" Anna looked around the parking lot as if afraid someone might be listening. 2 weeks ago, I found Charles in his office, with a bottle of pills and a glass of whiskey," she said quietly. "He was crying, saying he couldn't do it anymore. That everyone would be better off without him. David was in the next room, drawing pictures of airplanes like he always does. The picture was becoming clearer and more horrible. I've been David's nanny for 3 years, Anna continued. I love that little boy like he's my own, but I'm just the hired help. I have no legal rights, no way to protect him if Charles if something happens. So you took him to the airport. I thought if I left him somewhere safe, where good people would find him, maybe he'd get adopted by a family that actually wanted him. A family that would learn sign language and play with him, and not see his deafness as something to be fixed. Anna started crying again. I know it was wrong. I know I could go to prison. But Marcus, you should see how Charles looks at David sometimes. Like David is a reminder of everything he's lost. Everything he can't handle. Marcus thought about David's careful drawings, his excited reaction to the toy airplane, the way he'd typed, "Thank you," with such sincerity. Anna, Marcus said slowly, what if there was another way? What do you mean? Marcus took a deep breath, hardly believing what he was about to say. What if Charles Kingston decided he didn't want to be David's father anymore? What if he decided David would be better off with someone else? Anna stared at him. He would never agree to that. David is a Kingston. Charles's family doesn't just give away their children, even to save David's life? Marcus asked. The question hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross. Marcus thought of Sophia, thought of his cramped apartment, and his second-hand furniture and his bank account that never quite stretched to the end of the month. Then he thought of David's smile when he'd seen that toy airplane. I'm suggesting, Marcus said, that maybe it's time someone fought for David. Really, fought for him. Anna studied his face for a long moment. You'd be willing to take on Charles Kingston, one of the most powerful men in Colorado? Marcus thought about David typing Marcus and David at the bottom of his drawing. For that little boy? Marcus said. Yeah, I think I would. Neither of them knew that at that exact moment, Charles Kingston was sitting in his therapist's office, finally admitting out loud what he'd known for months. He was failing his son in every way that mattered. And David deserved so much better than a father who saw him as a burden instead of a blessing. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with the smallest admissions. Sometimes love means letting go. And sometimes, the answer to an impossible problem is standing right in front of you, holding a $3 toy airplane, and ready to fight for a child who isn't even his own. 3 weeks later, Marcus Rivera was sitting at his kitchen table, helping Sophia with her math homework, when the black limousine pulled up outside their apartment complex. Sophia pressed her nose against the window of their second-floor unit, her eyes wide with amazement. Papa, there's a fancy car outside, like in movies. Marcus looked up from the worksheet. They'd been struggling through third-grade multiplication that somehow seemed harder than rebuilding an engine, and felt his stomach drop. Through their thin curtains, he could see the sleek black vehicle parked next to his 15-year-old Honda, looking like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong galaxy. In the 3 weeks since David had been returned to his father, Marcus had thought about the little boy every single day. He'd called the foster facility twice to check on him, only to be told that David Kingston was back with his family and no longer in the system. He'd driven past the Kingston estate 4 times, always slowing down at the iron gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of sandy brown hair or hear the sound of a child playing. But the estate had remained as silent and imposing as a mausoleum. Marcus had also stayed in touch with Anna, who'd been quietly terminated from her position as David's nanny 2 days after their conversation. No charges had been filed. Charles Kingston had chosen to handle the matter privately, but Anna was now facing the impossible task of finding new employment with no reference from her previous employer. She called me yesterday, Anna had told Marcus during their last phone conversation. Charles's assistant. She said Mr. Kingston wanted to speak with me about David's care, but when I asked if I could see David to say goodbye, she said that wouldn't be possible. Now, watching the limousine idle outside his building, Marcus wondered if his unofficial investigation into David's situation had somehow reached Charles Kingston's attention. A man in a dark suit got out of the driver's seat and walked toward the building's entrance. Marcus heard footsteps on the metal stairs outside. Then, a firm knock on his door. Sophia looked at her father with the wide eyes of a 6-year-old who understood that something important was happening, even if she didn't know what. "Stay here, Mija," Marcus said softly, then walked to the door and opened it. The man standing there looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate security manual. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. "Marcus Rivera?" "That's me. My name is James Patterson. I work for Charles Kingston. Mr. Kingston would like to speak with you." Marcus glanced back at Sophia, who was pretending to work on her math, but was clearly listening to every word. About what? About David. The two words hit Marcus like an electric shock. Something had happened to David. "Is he okay?" Marcus asked immediately. James Patterson's expression softened slightly. "He's fine, Mr. Rivera, but Mr. Kingston would appreciate a few minutes of your time. There's something he'd like to discuss." "Daughter alone? She's welcome to come with you. Mr. Kingston specifically asked me to mention that." Sophia appeared at Marcus's elbow, having abandoned any pretense of doing homework. "Are we going in the fancy car?" she asked, with the kind of excitement that only a 6-year-old could muster. 5 minutes later, Marcus and Sophia were sitting in the back seat of the limousine. Sophia running her small hands over the leather seats and staring at the small television screen built into the partition. "Papa," she whispered, "this car is fancier than our whole apartment." Marcus had to agree. The limousine was a rolling monument to wealth crystal decanters, plush carpeting, and the kind of silence that only money could buy. As they drove through the increasingly expensive neighborhoods toward Cherry Hills Village, Marcus tried to imagine what Charles Kingston might want to discuss. Had David told his father about the hours they'd spent together at the foster facility? Had Anna mentioned their conversation? Or had something terrible happened to David? The limousine pulled through the iron gates of the Kingston estate, and Marcus got his first close look at where David lived. The house was enormous. 3 stories of glass and stone that seemed to stretch across acres of perfectly manicured lawn. But despite its size and obvious expense, there was something cold about it. Something that felt more like a museum than a home. James Patterson led them to a side entrance, through hallways lined with expensive art, and into a room that was clearly Charles Kingston's home office. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over formal gardens, and the walls were covered with awards, patents, and photographs of Charles shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. Charles Kingston stood behind an enormous oak desk, wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. But what surprised Marcus was how the man looked tired, thin, with the kind of pallor that came from spending too much time indoors. "Mr. Rivera," Charles said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. And this must be Sophia." Sophia stepped slightly behind her father, suddenly shy in the presence of such obvious wealth. "Sophia, there's a playroom just down the hall," Charles continued gently. "James, would you mind?" Marcus started to object, but Charles held up a hand. "She'll be perfectly safe, and she'll be able to see this room from there. I just thought the conversation might be easier without little ears listening." Marcus nodded reluctantly, and Sophia followed James out of the room, casting one last curious look over her shoulder. When they were alone, Charles gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." Marcus sat, his work boots looking out of place on the expensive Persian rug. Charles remained standing, looking out the window at his manicured gardens. "Mr. Rivera, I understand you've been asking questions about my son." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. I was concerned about him. So was I, Charles said quietly. So was I. The admission hung in the air between them. Charles turned back to face Marcus. Anna Restrepo told me about your conversation, about your suggestion. Look, Mr. Kingston, I wasn't trying to interfere. You just saw a little boy who needed someone to fight for him. Charles interrupted. Someone to see him as more than a problem to be managed. Marcus stayed silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. Charles sat down across from him, and for the first time, Marcus could see the full extent of the man's exhaustion. Mr. Rivera, I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone outside my therapist. I've been failing David since the day he was born. The words came out flat, matter of fact, but Marcus could hear the pain underneath them. His mother, Elizabeth, she was everything I wasn't. Patient, warm, intuitive. She learned sign language while she was pregnant, just in case. She read every book about deaf children, researched schools and programs and therapies. She was going to be the perfect mother. Charles's voice cracked slightly. When David was born and we confirmed his deafness, Elizabeth threw herself into his care. She learned advanced sign language, connected with the deaf community, made our house a place where David could thrive. She was magical with him. What happened to her? Cancer. Aggressive, fast-moving. She went from diagnosis to gone in 4 months. David was 3. Marcus felt his chest tighten. David had lost his mother just a year ago. After Elizabeth died, I told myself I would step up, that I would learn to be the father David needed. But every time I looked at him, Mr. Rivera, I saw everything I couldn't give him. I saw Elizabeth's patience, which I don't have. I saw her natural warmth, which I've never possessed. I saw her ability to communicate with him, and all I could think about was how clumsy my signing was, how frustrated David would get when I couldn't understand him. Charles stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. Do you know what David's day looks like, Mr. Rivera? Physical therapy at 8 a.m., speech therapy at 10, occupational therapy at 2, academic tutoring at 4, structured playtime with approved educational toys, dinner with nutritionally balanced meals designed by a pediatric dietitian. He dropped the folder on the desk with a heavy thud. That's his schedule. Every day. 7 days a week. No spontaneous trips to the park. No lazy Saturday mornings. No time to just be a 4-year-old boy who likes airplanes. Marcus thought about David's careful drawings, his excitement over a $3 toy plane. You've scheduled the joy right out of his life, Marcus said quietly. I've scheduled my guilt into his life, Charles corrected. Every therapy session, every tutor, every specialist, it's all me trying to fix what I see as broken instead of celebrating what's beautiful about him. Charles sat back down, and when he looked at Marcus, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Anna told me what you said. About fighting for David. About someone wanting to be his father who would see him as a blessing instead of a burden. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. Mr. Kingston, 3 days ago, I had to sign David up for a specialized boarding school in Connecticut. The best program in the country for deaf children, they told me. He'd live there year-round. Come home for holidays. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. You were going to send him away? I convinced myself it was for his own good, that he'd be better off with professionals who knew how to work with children like him? Charles laughed bitterly. Children like him, as if being deaf made him some kind of foreign species, instead of just a little boy who sees the world differently. Marcus thought about Sophia, about how, fiercely, He'd fight anyone who tried to separate them. What changed your mind? Charles reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a piece of paper. Marcus recognized it immediately. It was one of David's airplane drawings. Yesterday, David drew this, Charles said, sliding the paper across the desk. Look at the bottom. Marcus looked. In David's careful 4-year-old handwriting, he'd written, David, Miss Marcus. Marcus felt his throat close up. He's been drawing pictures of you constantly, Charles continued. You, him, airplanes. Sometimes he includes Sophia, even though he's never met her. He draws families, Mr. Rivera. Happy families. And in every single picture, you're there. Charles pulled out more drawings. Page after page of stick figures, Marcus and David at the airport, Marcus and David with airplanes, Marcus and David and Sophia having what looked like a picnic. I hired 3 different child psychologists to evaluate David's drawings. They all said the same thing. This is a child drawing his emotional reality, not his physical one. He feels more connected to a man he spent 2 hours with than he does to the father he's lived with his whole life. Marcus stared at the drawings, seeing David's longing laid out in crayon and hope. Mr. Kingston, what are you asking me? Charles stood up and walked to the window again. I'm asking if you meant it. When you told Anna you'd be willing to fight for David, because I'm not going to fight you. The room went silent, except for the sound of Marcus's heartbeat in his ears. I'm asking, Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper, if you'd be willing to adopt my son, legally, permanently, completely. Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. You want me to adopt David? I want David to have a father who sees his deafness as just another part of who he is, not as something to be fixed or managed or hidden away in a boarding school. Charles turned back to face him. I want him to have a father who'll learn sign language because he wants to talk to his son, not because a therapist told him he had to. I want him to have a father who'll let him draw airplanes all day, if that makes him happy, who'll take him to the airport just to watch planes take off. Kingston, I want him to have a father who'll look at him and see possibility instead of limitation. Charles sat back down, and when he spoke again, his voice was steadier. I've already spoken with my lawyers. If you agree, I'm prepared to voluntarily terminate my parental rights and pay for the entire adoption process. I'll also establish a trust fund to cover David's medical expenses, his education, whatever he needs. Marcus felt dizzy. You're offering to pay me to adopt your son? No, Charles said firmly. I'm offering to ensure that David has every advantage while giving him the most important thing I can't. A father who actually wants to be his father. Through the glass doors that separated the office from the playroom, Marcus could see Sophia playing with toys that probably cost more than his rent. But more importantly, he could see David. The little boy was sitting in the corner of the playroom, drawing on a large piece of paper spread out on the floor. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the familiar shapes, airplanes, stick figures, careful block letters. As if sensing he was being watched, David looked up and saw Marcus through the glass. His face transformed with that brilliant smile, and he jumped up, running to the glass doors. David pressed his small hands against the glass and began signing something rapidly. His face animated with excitement. "What's he saying?" Marcus asked. Charles watched his son for a moment, and for the first time since Marcus had met him, the man's expression was soft. "He's saying, Marcus came back. Marcus came back to play with airplanes." Marcus stood up and walked to the glass doors. David was practically vibrating with excitement, still signing, rapidly. "He's asking if you brought him another airplane," Charles translated quietly. "He's asking if Sophia wants to draw with him. He's asking if you can stay for dinner." Marcus looked down at this little boy who'd somehow claimed a piece of his heart in the space of 2 hours 3 weeks ago. And he knew his answer. But first, he had a question. "Mr. Kingston, will you let me ask you something?" Charles nodded. "Do you love David?" The question seemed to hit Charles like a physical blow. He closed his eyes for a long moment. "More than my own life," he whispered, "which is why I can't keep him." Marcus understood. This wasn't a man abandoning his child. This was a man making the most loving choice he could imagine, giving his son the chance to be wanted, to be celebrated, to be seen as perfect, exactly as he was. "If I say yes," Marcus said slowly, "what happens to you and David? Do you just disappear?" Charles's face crumpled slightly. "I was thinking, maybe, I could be. Uncle Charles? Someone who visits sometimes, who maybe takes him to museums or science exhibits when he gets older. Someone who loves him, but doesn't have to be responsible for his daily happiness. Someone who doesn't have to fail him every single day," Charles said quietly. Marcus looked back at David, who was now pressing his whole face against the glass, his breath fogging it up as he grinned. Sophia appeared beside David, and Marcus watched as she began trying to communicate with him. She pointed to herself and said, "Sophia," clearly, then pointed to him and signed something that looked like she was trying to fingerspell her name. David's eyes went wide with delight. He grabbed a piece of paper and wrote "Sophia" in his careful block letters, then showed it to her. Sophia clapped and nodded enthusiastically. Marcus felt something settle in his chest, a rightness he hadn't expected. "Mr. Kingston," he said, still watching the two children. "I make $38,000 I live in a 2-bedroom apartment with furniture I bought at thrift stores. I work 2 jobs to pay for Sophia's asthma medication." Charles watched him quietly. "I don't know sign language. I don't know anything about deaf children or special education or therapy schedules." Marcus turned back to face Charles. "But I know how to love a child who needs loving. I know how to show up every day and read bedtime stories and make pancakes on Sunday morning and teach a kid that they're perfect exactly the way they are." Charles's eyes filled with tears. "So yes," Marcus said. "Yes, I'll adopt David. But on one condition." "What?" "We do this right. You don't just disappear. David's going to have questions, and he deserves honest answers about why his father made this choice. He deserves to know that you loved him enough to find him a better father." Charles nodded, wiping his eyes. "And one more thing," Marcus continued. "That trust fund you mentioned, I don't want it for David's medical expenses or education." Charles looked confused. "I want it to start a foundation for other families dealing with what we've all dealt with. Parents who are overwhelmed. Children who need advocates. Caregivers like Anna, who risk everything to protect kids." A smile crossed Charles's face for the first time since Marcus had met him. "Elizabeth would have loved that idea," he said softly. Marcus opened the glass doors, and David launched himself into his arms, with the kind of trust that only children possess. Sophia appeared beside them, beaming with the pride of someone who'd successfully made a new friend despite the language barrier. "Papa," she said in Spanish, then switched to English for David's benefit. "David drew me a picture of all of us having a party." David handed Marcus the drawing he'd been working on. It showed 4 stick figures: Marcus, Sophia, David, and a taller figure labeled Uncle Charles, standing around what appeared to be a birthday cake. At the plast bottom, in David's determined handwriting, he'd written, "Happy Family." Marcus looked at Charles, who was watching his son with an expression of wonder and grief and hope, all mixed together. Marcus said to David, speaking clearly so the boy could read his lips while simultaneously trying to sign what he hoped meant family. "Are you ready to come home with us?" David's answer was to hug Marcus tighter and nod so enthusiastically that his sandy brown hair flopped into his eyes. 3 hours later, as they drove back to Marcus's apartment complex in Charles's limousine, this time with David's belongings filling the trunk, and David himself asleep against Marcus's shoulder, Marcus thought about the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment. Sometimes the most important decisions in life happen in airports at midnight, between the end of one story and the beginning of another. Sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes it means holding on. And sometimes it means being brave enough to build a family out of broken pieces and second chances, and the kind of hope that only children know how to carry. David stirred against Marcus's shoulder and signed something in his sleep. Sophia, who'd been watching David sign all afternoon and picking up words with the quick adaptability of childhood, smiled. "I think he said, 'Home, Papa.'" Marcus looked out the window at the city lights blurring past, holding his daughter with one arm and his new son with the other, and realized that sometimes home isn't a place. Sometimes home is a choice. Sometimes home is courage. Sometimes home is love, brave enough to start over. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.